Okay, so I'm gonna get us started here. Just as a sort of quick one. So hello, everybody. My name is Mark. I'm one of the co-founders here at Qwilr. I mostly look after the go-to-market side of things. So on the COO side, so work with Jonathon, who you'll meet in a second, who's our lovely VP of sales, as well as the marketing folks and customer success, et cetera, et cetera. We are joined today by the wonderful Dave Shepherd, who has been a good friend of mine for a long time, was at HubSpot for, Shep, how long were you there for? 10?
A full decade. Yeah. Almost to the day.
One of the OG HubSpotters was in Boston for a long time, came out here and opened and sort of led the Australian sales office and the Australian office just generally for a long time. And is a sales guru, is currently advising a whole bunch of startups, including some good friends of ours, on their sort of next journey in this space. And we've also got Jonathon Blackburn here, who is Qwilr's VP of sales. Before that was the lead. What was your title exactly, JB, at Lattice? You ran enterprise.
Exactly, yeah. Head of enterprise and strategic sales.
Yeah. So and then has a long history before that, sort of leading sales teams. Is a real sort of for the Aussies in the realm, is a real sort of San Francisco sales guru. So we're very, very lucky to have him on the team. And so I'm joined by like I think two people who I regularly lean on for sales advice, and who regularly sort of speak to and talk through things with. And I think hopefully we're going to have a really great call today, going through everything on that side. So as we go through today, please feel free to drop things in the chat in the webinar. Also feel free to drop things in Q&A. We're going to try to keep this pretty light. We're going to have some space at the end for questions if there are any, but also just generally speaking, if something comes in that looks good, we'll try to sort of address it in the moment and just sort of keep this engaged and interesting. So let's go on from there. So the topic today is around buyer engagement. And I think like this has been a hot topic in sales land for a while, and sort of thinking around this sort of space. But like, Shep, why do we care about this? Why are we here today? Why are we talking about buyer engagement? Why does it matter?
Because our whole world has changed. We all know this. Whether we want to blame it on the pandemic or just technology improving, I think a lot of that comes into this. So I think the first big change is that everything is just a lot more virtual. We've been seeing this trend for a decade now, where, field sales teams have become inside sales teams. Inside sales teams have become closer to kind of PLG type sales teams, where it's just the number of contacts that a sales team has with a customer is becoming less and less and less. And we can kind of globally call that as like, we're moving more towards a virtual world. But there's a whole bunch of things that have happened, both in terms of the way our physical lives have changed, but also just technology going. I think there's also a move to buyers doing a lot more research in between calls, before calls. Like the sales reps just have way less control. I think all of us salespeople live in a world where we think we have a ton of control, or are trying to maintain control over the sales process. And it just more and more that's becoming obvious that we never really had control, but the buyers are doing a lot more research before they talk to us and during the sales process. So that's another big one. I think that also uncertainty in the market, like especially recently, whether we're in a recession or not, I'll let you guys or the listeners decide whether we are or not. But I just think that means there's more scrutiny on everything. And so your champions become more important, but also there's way more decision makers in on the process. And sometimes that means there's a committee that's buying, which I think if you're a salesperson is literally the world's worst nightmare, because you can't talk to everyone that's on the committee. We've always known there's multiple decision makers, and we have all sorts of acronyms to describe the different types and all that. But things are just changing, and people are weighing up their decisions way more than they ever have. And how do we continue to be successful as salespeople when that's the case? And I think that's probably the biggest change in the last couple of months.
JB, what does it mean for you? Yeah, how do you think about this sort of shift towards a focus on buyer engagement?
Yeah, I think without seconding a lot of what Shep mentioned, it feels like over the past couple years, but especially a couple months, there's more friction in like buyer seller engagements than there ever has been before. And I think to a lot of points you made, it's because things have shifted to more of a remote virtual world. There's more people involved. I think there's also the aspect of yes, sales is more virtual and remote than I think it ever has been, but also buyers are more virtual and remote. Buyers aren't all in the same location. They're not all in the same place having a conversation. They can't, stay in the conference room for a couple minutes after they get off the call, which is something I used to do quite a bit when I was in the buying chair. And I think all of that, in addition to what Shep mentioned, I think just adds to more friction. And I think it's more important now than it really ever has been to shift focus and shift thought, mental capacity, and calories to thinking about how to enable less friction between sellers and buyers.
What a great call. I couldn't agree with you more.
That's yeah, just again, huge plus one. Actually, like we've been doing our prep for this webinar, and that's a great framing. I think the issue of not only are there more people involved in the buying process, especially now, if you're, maybe finance is getting more involved, maybe you're doing some larger deals and there's more security, like security is becoming more and more of a, like, it should have perhaps always been a thing, but like security is becoming more of a thing that sort of gets in the loop and sometimes gets in the way in a kind of rubbish way. But I think I think that we sort of, as not only are there more people on the thing, but you're right, like more teams are remote and it is harder for the buyer to sync up on that. And how do you like engage with them, enable them to like actually have a good buying process? Also in a world that sort of is, I think also moving towards being like desiring, like more impatient and desiring speed and everything else, like even as you have that sort of those sort of friction points thrown in. So I suppose like that this is nice. I mean, it's a nice sort of like way to sort of lean into like sort of our next sort of chat. And I think that's a great overview. It's like, why are we here? What do we sort of care about? How are we going to try to sort of move the needle on this side? What do buyers actually like? What do they actually care about? And so Sarah, who the wonderful Sarah is also on the call. She's from marketing at Qwilr. She's helping us out, making our lives easy. So Sarah's going to kick off a poll that we have here for everybody on the call. So we'd love to sort of get your feedback on that. So Sarah, whenever you're ready, kick off that poll. So we're going to ask, what do buyers care about in 2023? And so you can go through this one. There's price, there's customer service, there's trust in suppliers, delivering business value, demonstrating ROI, or solving pain points. And so you can select as many of these as you like that you think people like really care about. Maybe don't select all, but like maybe select all. But I think like please go through on that sort of side there. I'm going to share a little one that I've got at the moment. I mean, well, actually, no. I think just looking at this, actually, before I do that, before the poll comes in and gets answered here, Shep, what do you think is going to be in there? And we'll see if you're right.
For me, it's close between solving pain points and trust. I just the trust thing is so important.
Yeah. JB?
Yeah, I like to keep myself intellectually honest here, thinking as a sales leader, but also someone who buys things and kind of evaluates. I really do think that like understanding the problem, the pain is really important. As a buyer, it gives me confidence that what I'm saying to you isn't kind of going in one ear and out the other, but also that you understand, at least at a high level, what my business is, what we do, why what I'm describing to you is important. And I also think that kind of dovetails into like the questions you ask and building trust through those relationships. If I had to pick one, I would say trust, because I think that filters into all of these things, but those are kind of the process I go through.
Okay, Sarah, are we able to see the results? All right, here we go.
Wow, look at that. So close.
There we go. I think, I'm going to say, like, I'm not shocked to see low cost come up a decent amount. Like, I think that's I think that's typically we sort of think about that as being I think in sales, we sort of think about that as being a little bit bullshit sometimes, but I think actually now there are genuinely some moments where that really does come through. Yeah. Now that we've seen the results, just quickly, Shep, what are your thoughts here?
My first gut response was like, I was surprised that they were so even. And then my next thought was, it does depend on what you're selling. So, in some ways, if we have, a couple hundred people on the webinar, they're coming from all different walks of life in terms of what they're selling. And so all of these are important. And it's in one way, it's not surprising. But my first gut response was like, oh, wow, I didn't expect them to be mostly neck and neck the whole way, right?
JB?
I think the ROI thing is important. In some ways, I think cost and ROI are kind of always intertwined a little bit. I can see cost being so important, especially now where, going back to the whole friction point, there is so much friction in just being able to even buy things, regardless of what the ROI may be, and like the amount of friction that kind of that creates. I was surprised to see ROI as high as it was, but I can definitely understand that. I think when you're trying to make a business case for something now, it's harder than ever.
Yeah, and I think the one that surprised me was one of the lowest ones on there was trust in suppliers, and I think that's one that I'd push back upon. I mean, I know, I mean, like, again, everyone has their own sort of thing here, but I think like actually trust in suppliers is, especially if you're in a market that has some degree of, again, as Shep said, like, are we in a recession? Certainly tech world is in a funny space. And I think like everybody is definitely being like far more cost conscious than they were, start of last year. And I think that trust in suppliers, I think like a big part of, like, if you might have limited capacity to spend this year. And if you are, you really want to make sure that actually leads to results. And so do you really trust this is going to really work? Do you trust your supplier is going to come through? If things go wrong, is it like, how's that going to be dealt with? Like, I actually think that trust is always important, but I think it's actually especially important now. And I think given the friction we talked about before, about like being remote, about buyers doing like far more research beforehand, like trust gets quite multifaceted. It's not just like, oh, like JB's a great guy, I trust him. It's sort of actually more about like how you sort of build that across multiple people, across like trust, as like trust within the org as well, but also trust like in that sort of broader sense of, do I trust HubSpot the brand, or Qwilr the brand, or whatever else on that sort of side. And I think that can sort of be pretty impactful.
Mark, I'm not going to mince words. I think you're absolutely right, but I'm just going to put a bullet, just like hammer this home. Trust is far more important than you think. End of story. Especially if you're selling something that is not like a point solution. And what I mean by point solution, it does one thing. If it's complex in any way and your product can help a customer in more than one way, I'm going to throw out this, like, the poll is wrong. Trust is so paramount. It is the most important thing. And I think one reason why it might have been low in the poll is because people are selling different things. But another reason is it's really hard to define when you're good at building trust and when you have it with customers. We lose most deals as salespeople to indecision, meaning the customer makes no decision.
Yes.
And to me, that is a sign that we don't have trust. If you're selling a product that actually helps your customers and they don't make a decision, it's because you didn't build enough trust. End of story.
I will add actually one thing to that. I did say trust to begin with, so hopefully I have some credibility here too. But at its core, like, as people, like, we buy from people, and until or when or if AI or chat GPT or other tools learn how to sell for us, we're always buying from people. And I think the important thing, at least how I think about it and frame it, is what causes us to trust someone. And if I look at most of the things on there, I'm more likely to trust someone if I feel like I'm listened to, if I feel like they understand my business, if I believe they can deliver a positive ROI, and if I believe they're being honest. And so I think that's kind of why I lean to the trust. But at its core, I will say, people still buy from people.
Yeah, I think like one thing I sort of added here, and so I had this. I was just reflecting personally, and sometimes it's good with these situations to like not just think about this from, yourself as a seller, but also think about like when with my buying hat on, like what do I actually do? Like, what do I actually care about? And I was just sort of thinking about like the last time I spent a decent chunk of money, which was with a plumber. We just did it anyway. Yeah. So there were some things that needed to be fixed in our house. And I think like really the thing that mattered was that we have someone that we've worked with in the past that I really trust. And like, yes, I don't think he rips me off. And yes, I, blah, blah, blah. But I just like genuinely trust that this like relatively critical problem will be solved. And I think the other one is that he was not fast to get here, but he was super fast to reply and was like very responsive, very clear, very transparent, very good communication. Like he didn't turn up, like it wasn't, look, that house wasn't flooded, but like he didn't turn up like that. He wasn't like, oh, I can do it right now. He's great. He's got a busy work schedule, but he replied super quickly, was super clear, was good on text, was good on calls. And I think that there's like buyers today are actually, I do think there is like an impatience around this. Is like, I know that wasn't part of the quiz, but I do think there is something valuable also in around like just like generally sellers and buyers and like speed of communications. And I think that partially helps in building trust. I think it also just helps in being like, you're serious, you care, you take this, like you sort of take this seriously, but also people just like want to get stuff done. And it's kind of impatient and kind of just want to like, let's move forward. And I think like having someone who you feel like you can rely upon to get back to you quickly, this is like already like just a known good trait to have, I think, in sales and in business generally. It's lovely to work with colleagues who do the same thing. But I do think that's like a really important sort of point as well. And I don't know if you guys have like a specific opinion on that sort of one, on like that speed of responsiveness, but that's just something that I did, upon like reflection, did strike me.
I know what we're going to get to later in the webinar. And so I'm just going to like bite my tongue for a second so that we get to all the things, and I'll tell the stories later. I totally agree. I have lots to say. Yes.
Okay. So I think like we sort of talked, we've started this call off having a chat about like buyer engagement. Like, why does it matter? What buyers actually care about, and getting a bit of a sense of that. So I think like just to sort of roll into the next sort of zone, like, the sales teams, like, how do sellers go at doing with this? And I think like, I'd love to talk to you guys in this sort of section just a bit about like, what are some of the biggest mistakes you've seen sellers make in going after this? And sometimes sellers make a mistake of like omission, where like they just don't do something, but sometimes they'll make the mistake where they're like trying to do something and it's sort of going in the sort of the wrong direction. But also I think like also important, like what are some of the best practices? What are some of the things you've seen from sellers that you've worked with recently, just that really have like led down a path of really excellent buyer engagement? And if there are tools or other things you want to talk about here, but that's great too. JB, let's kick it off with you, mate. What sort of comes to mind when you sort of think about like best practices for buyer engagement for sellers?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I think I'm going to maybe take a slightly different maybe approach to the question. So we actually have someone on the sales team. She's been with Qwilr for a couple of years, and previously being in sales, she was actually with Qwilr and kind of the support success side of the house. And so she isn't what you'd consider a classically trained seller. She's also one of, if not our top seller on the team on a pretty regular, consistent basis. Amazing at what she does, but doesn't have a lot of the classically trained kind of approaches and methods and all that fun stuff that you think would be associated with someone who's top on the team. And one of the things that the thing that she's really best at and amazing at is quickly coming into a conversation, building rapport, being brutally honest, sometimes in not always the best way, but brutally honest about where Qwilr can help, speaking to Qwilr a bit, like where we can help, where we don't help, what we're good at, what we're not good at. And I do think that builds trust very quickly because it isn't typical of most salespeople to lead with like, hey, these are the things we don't do and kind of don't want to do and can't help you do. And she's also amazing at really digging into the discovery and understanding the prospect's process. There was a call I listened to not too long ago, a couple of days ago, where she actually made the person share their screen and walk through step by step and spent about 20 minutes kind of going through their process, to the point where she understood it incredibly well, to the point where by the end of the conversation, the prospect was very uncomfortable and nervous because he had to describe this to someone in a way he never had, and actually hold himself a bit accountable to what had happened and what he had built. And so I think like in some ways that touches on the previous points, but I will say like I think it's even more important these days to lean into this, and from a buyer process, from a seller process, however you kind of look at it, going back to building that trust, but also just like really understanding what you're good at as a company, as a team, what you're not so good at, and being comfortable digging deep in discovery, I think are some of the things that really separates good from what I'll consider like great or amazing salespeople in times like this, where it's never been easy to sell. It's never been easy to sell. There have been times where it's been easier, but I would definitely say this is a time where it's a little bit tougher to sell.
JB, I got a question for you. You mentioned the process piece. That's killer. I think that's so good. But you said discovery. What do you mean when you say discovery? Because I'll tell you, I've coached hundreds of small business owners how to sell, and I've coached dozens of startups, founders, right? Sales leaders. I've coached lots and lots of sales reps, hundreds of sales reps at my time at HubSpot. And discovery is always, I'm not joking, always the number one skill that people need to improve. So what does discovery mean to you? What do you mean besides just the process piece?
I think it's the ability to ask questions in a conversation, questions that can help you understand the current state of where someone is, maybe the state of where they want to get to, what a process currently looks like, what they might want it to look like, what is and isn't working. So to answer your question, I think that's how I would describe discovery at its core. Just simplest, it's like the ability to ask questions that are impactful. I think one of the things that at least from my perspective, that separates good from great discovery is the ability to ask second and third level questions. So not just like, hey, what do you want it to look like? Why do you want it to look like that? Why do you think it isn't, in this particular example, that way? Why isn't it actually looking like that? What have you tried? What has worked? What hasn't worked? Like, help me understand. Like, so just asking those second and third level questions, I think are really important. There's a framework that I've always used, which is like level one is like technical problem, the business problem. I think the thing that as people we always want to like quickly align to. Second is like what is the business like impact? Like, okay, it's a problem. Why is that a problem? Why does that actually matter? And the third, which is usually the hardest to get, depending on the industry you're in and who you're selling to, is the personal impact. Why does that matter to you? Why does that matter to you as a leader, as a person, or to your point in the business?
I'm so happy you brought those three things in. Sorry, Mark, I know you're going to talk, but I'm too
No,
excited.
no.
One of the best boss I ever had, G2 Matani, he was relentless about those exact three questions. I want to add in two more things. So I was going to say there's three things that really mark great discovery. One is understanding the impact, right? Impact on the business, impact on the individual or that team. That's huge. The other two, I think, are not often talked about in sales, which is emotions and opinions. People buy with their heart before they buy with their mind. You have to get them to say, yes, I want this, which is an emotional response. And then the whole rest of the sales process is about satisfying their logical brain. So I was just giving a startup feedback yesterday, and they have like a 3-month program that they're selling. And it is like life-changing for their customers, truly life-changing. It's a health type of product. It is life-changing, without a doubt. And the thing I was trying to impress upon them was like, find out as early on what the impact of your customer's health condition is having on their life. Like that, like, how do they feel about that? Are they scared? Are they sad? Are they frustrated? Are they annoyed? And how does that impact the people around them? You don't have to use that information, but just getting that information out in the open builds immense trust. You can sit there on the call and say, I hear you. I get that. That must be tough, right? People are angry. People are sad. People are fearful. But once you get that stuff out in the open, the level of trust that's built will automatically allow your customer to gravitate towards your product if it fits their needs, because they're going to self-acknowledge that they're not in a perfect state and that your product can actually help them change that. So I think emotions and opinions are super important. And I love opinions. One of my favorite ways to ask about opinions is just you pick someone not on the phone call, but is important to the buying process, and ask, what do you think that person thinks of this? What's their opinion? And because you get two things, you get the person's opinion that you're talking to, and you get their opinion of what they think their boss or one of the other decision makers thinks. And that's pure gold later in the process.
Totally. I will actually add to the impact part too. I'm glad you brought that up. This is kind of the B2B salesperson in me, so I can't help but kind of go back to this. I do think impact, like in this, like now, I think more than in previous times is even more important, because that goes back to ROI, it goes back to some of those things. But I don't think ROI is enough these days. Like ROI is kind of almost like table stakes. Like if I give you money, will I get significant value back, twofold, threefold, fourfold in return? I think the other piece to that, and I think the more important, like this kind of second level to that is, okay, so like we understand the impact, we understand that there is an ROI, but like where does this stack rank? Like if the ROI is, I'm just going to throw a random number out there, $1 million, great, but are there 5 other things you're looking at that have an ROI of 5 million or 10 million or way more important to the business? And so I think like sellers can sometimes, we all get happy years, right? But you can get kind of stuck into this, great, like there is an impact and we provide ROI, but like how important is that ROI considering other things that they might be looking at? I think it's something that kind of gets overlooked a little bit more than it should, especially now.
Great call, JP.
I'm loving this. I will say, I think that we're sort of getting to some fundamentals here, which is always good to get to like sort of philosophical first principles of sales. But I think like there is a sort of an underlying truth of like, if you desire to drive buyer engagement, I think there is something about like genuine understanding, genuine curiosity that leads you down a path towards genuine understanding. And it's not some inauthentic bullshit. It's definitely not some like, I mean, well, I was about to rag on checklists. Checklists, as per the JB example before, where you're like, have I done something to like actually lead me down a path of understanding? I think it's meaningful versus being like, I must ask these exact 3 questions that someone has written for me in a script. Like that's kind of, all that script stuff can kind of be like well-intentioned, but often like immediately misused. And I think that like those sort of paths, as well as having like a solid dash of like, empathy and understanding. And frankly, again, like that sort of honesty of like, I love that example you gave of that sales rep in Qwilr, JB, where, I too have watched gone calls where she's like, yeah, this is not a fit for you. And I think like, I think that I actually was having a thing with someone close to me recently about this thing that they were doing in their work. And they were like, what if they just say no? And like, there's no way this can happen. They had this sort of like relatively big ask. And I'm like, that's awesome. Best thing other than a yes is a quick no. Like if you just get to know that the answer is no, very quickly, that's the sort of wonderful thing. And I think whether that's seller-led or buyer-led is I think can be also be very, very valuable. Yes, Sarah has pinged us again. If you do have questions about anything we're talking about, we are a very chatty bunch and happy to sort of dive into them. So feel free to use the chat function. Feel free to use the Q&A function, but they should both be open and available and working. So feel free to jump in. We'd love to answer anything you have, whether it's a weird question or off topic or who knows. There are no stupid questions on this space. Okay, I think just sort of on this though, I do want to sort of quickly sort of just re-scratch something here. So like, outside of discovery, and I think this sort of area here, which is discovery is awesome. We all agree. I think it's probably the most important thing. But just generally outside of discovery, like what do you guys think are some of the better habits that people have around like buyer engagement, or flip side, things that you think that reps get a bit like do poorly? I think just sort of generally on that sort of side. Do either of you have something you want to sort of throw to here? Shep, I'm going to go to you first.
Yeah. So discovery doesn't matter if you don't tailor everything else you do after that, right? Like you're learning that knowledge so that you can customize the whole rest of the conversation. And I think a lot of sales reps, very good sales reps, do this on calls, right? The big difference between like a new sales rep who's trying to follow a script and has a checklist of questions, right? And a really seasoned rep who might not be doing any of that stuff, but is way more successful, is that the seasoned rep has done all of that homework in the past. And now they're picking up on cues that the new rep just can't possibly pick up on. But the thing that they're best at is tailoring the solution to that person. So I think great sales reps do that on calls. I think where people screw up the most is they don't then turn that into content. And so I have a friend named Kian, and he sells big like service contracts, right? Like consulting contracts. These are $50,000, $100,000 type things. He's won 10 proposals in a row. And he's like, there's 3 reasons why. I might be over glorifying. These might not be exactly his words, but I'm just going to blow him up because he's so good. He's like the best at discovery. He's amazing. When he sends a proposal though, it is perfectly tailored. Every single thing is its own. Like he wrote the sentence for that prospect or for that customer, right? And then the third thing is that it is stunningly beautiful. It's like artist level looking proposals. And I think that builds so much trust. Again, going back to this trust thing, but like great discovery, great tailoring of what he does that's perfectly in tune with what the customer needs. They're not lies. He's actually going to deliver on all that. And it looks stunning. Like he sent me one of his proposals. Like it was unbelievable. It literally looked like he had a graphic artist design the whole thing, right? 10 for 10. That is unbelievable. That's not possible.
I'm just going to quickly jump in here. Margaret has thrown in a Q&A to let us know that the chat has been disabled. So a bad one on our side there, but the Q&A is working. Thank you, Margaret, for using the Q&A to do that. So please do throw any questions you have in the Q&A. Wonderfully, Seth has one in here right now, which is, how do you balance between tailoring a proposal and like risking time on a proposal you may not get? Cool boy, do I have a self-interested opinion on this? But Shep, seeing as you were just sort of going down that path, how do you think about that before the Qwilr people start getting in with their thoughts?
Yeah, I'll tell you, like, really simple. You assign homework to the customer. They as early on in the sales process as possible, you ask them questions where they have to do something other than just show up to the phone call. One of my favorites is asking for someone's mobile phone number or cell phone number. It just shows, it shows that they're open to communication. Another is, maybe you get to the end of the discovery call, and no discovery call is perfect. There's always something that you didn't get to. And so, maybe you ask them to send you something in between. So when I was at HubSpot, back in the early days, we helped people with their website generate more leads. And so I might ask them, hey, send me the titles of 5 blog posts that you might write, because that was a big thing that we help people with, right? As we move down the line, I might have asked them, can you send me your Google Analytics for the last 30 days? Like, these are like not that hard to do, but it's a little bit of homework. And if someone does them, it shows they're committed. They're acting with integrity. Not that they would be lying or anything, but just like integrity in the sense that like they're continuing down this conversation and actively participating. So if I would be thinking about this way before I got to the proposal stage, right? But also great follow-up emails, great frequent communication in terms of content along the way. All of that stuff really helps.
JB, how would you answer Seth's question?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a line that comes to mind, which is famous for a specific sales methodology, which I won't go into, but it's no unpaid consulting. To go back into what that actually kind of like might look like or might mean, I think there's 2 things that I think are really important. One, getting incredibly ruthless about what your ICP is, your ideal client profile, what that looks like. What are the customers that you do well, that you can solve problems for, and the ones that actually want to like work and speak with you. There's a company I was at previously where we had a big play to go after a specific integration partner of ours because we had aligned, if they use this tool, they are a good fit for our company. And it just made so much sense. It felt so obvious. We did it and we saw very little returns off of that, which was concerning and confusing because we had a lot of big name brands, think, apps you have in your phone, coming to us inbound, raising their hand and saying, we want to talk to you. But what we actually found is, for a variety of reasons, we lost most of those deals, but we lost them slowly. And so there were deals that we won quickly that were squarely within our ICP. And then there was deals with companies that we wanted to talk to that, quite frankly, actually wanted to talk to us too, because it came to us, but ultimately didn't buy from us. And so we eventually made a strategy shift to essentially basically say, hey, if someone uses this integration, this tool, we're going to say no to them. And it was painful. It was very painful up front to kind of have to say no to some of those customers, but important. And I think just a quick story to highlight the importance of ICP. But also the second thing I mentioned, which I think is really important, is feeling comfortable saying no. As salespeople, it's really hard for us. It's something I battle with after 15 years. But no is my second favorite answer, like a distant second, far second. But I find it to be really important to give people the opportunity to opt out multiple times in the conversation, to set the guidelines upfront in a discovery call or an introductory call or a first meeting, to outline the possible outcomes of a call or the conversation, how things could go. Give people the opportunity to continue to opt out, and sometimes even push them towards that direction if I feel like they need to, because then typically if they're squarely within our ICP, they have problems we can solve, and I've given them every option to opt out of that conversation, but they're still interested in continuing the discussion, more often than not, to me, that's a pretty good signal that there's like mutual value there. And I think exactly what Shep mentioned too, giving them homework, having little things you can do to continue to test and validate that interest and desire, I think are really important.
I think just quickly on this one, on Seth's one, so like story time, sort of founder story time. Sorry, everybody, but like the origin story of Qwilr is like basically along this line. So Dylan, my co-founder, when he started Qwilr, he had this sort of design and like software agency that he was running, and he was doing a lot of work for some of the big like Ogilvy and Saatchi and such, things like this, and he was basically designing these like beautiful PDFs, and he was something like, this is so, I send them out and I put all this effort in, and it looks so rubbish, and I can't reuse stuff well, and it's like a PDF, and I'm like a digital design person. Anyway, he basically got a job that came in that was like, if he won it, would be like, hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was by far their biggest one they'd seen that stage. And of course, later on, they went to do even bigger stuff. But he was just like, I'm just going to like hand code a website for this, which is like in 2010. And so he just went and like spent like 4 days building a website. Now, like to Seth's point, like that is an insane risk to go and do that for like one proposal. Now he won that. And then every time he had a good quality job come in, he would just go over the top. And I do think that like, and he won, I think his record wasn't 10 for 10, but I think it was like, 7 from 8 or whatever else. And one of the people there came back and said, hey, this is unbelievable. Like, is this a product? Can I use this? And then thus the slow journey towards Qwilr being built came from that. I mean, I think the flip side though is like, Seth, there are jobs that come in that it's like, hey, I'm looking for $500, and you're like, cool, I'm not going to make you a proposal. I'm going to send you a quick email. Here's a link to buy. And I think like understanding that threshold there can be important. But I will say that one of the things it can do, especially if you have like a relatively repetitive business, is early on, it's totally fine to go pretty heavy, I think, like risking with time, like go over the top and kind of find where that limit is, and then start to like either try to template things, whether it's in a tool like Qwilr or something else, but just like push it all the way and become excellent at it, like do the thing that doesn't scale, but then start to figure out little ways you can be more efficient. And that's actually a better way of getting to a great answer on a regular basis that's fast than like trying to sort of go the other way of trying to be really fast at the front. You kind of go slow to go fast a little bit on that sort of side. Okay, we're now like behind time a little bit here, so I'm going to race on a little bit. Please keep asking questions when it gets them towards the end. Okay, so we've talked a lot about a bunch of like really interesting sort of things on this side. I think one of the things we touched on at the start of the call, we're in this virtual world. we are all in different, two of us are in different rooms in Sydney, JB's in San Francisco. Across Qwilr, we've got, leaders in Melbourne, in Portland, in SF, in Sydney. We've got team members, all around the world. Like, how do you sell to somebody when you're, not in the room with them, but then also B, when like, most of the selling happens as they then take that to their buying committee or their sort of, whether or not it's a committee per se, but like there are others who have either formal or informal influence over whether a deal gets done. Like, how do you enable that space to sell when you're not in the room? And this can touch on content in different ways. It can touch on a whole bunch of stuff, but yeah, how do you think about that? JB, I'm going to throw to you on this one.
Yeah, I think it's tough. I've been doing this for a while, and over the years, I've seen that there always has kind of seemed to be a gap between like, discovery calls typically pretty easy. Do we want to do at least in SaaS, there's like the next step is usually some version of like a demo or a demonstration or showing what the actual product, like it's usually pretty easy to get someone to move from like an initial conversation to taking a deeper dive look at the tool. After that demo, after as a salesperson, after you kind of showed them everything that they want to see and what they want to hear and had some of those initial conversations, it usually either proceeds or it just ends pretty abruptly. And I think there's a gap between what happens after you have that deep dive conversation, the demo if you're in B2B SaaS or whatever you want to call it, and how you communicate and like how you enable that person to get the information they need, but also to move the deal forward. And so I've seen firsthand, there's always been a kind of a big gap there, and different teammates, different people on my team, different companies try to use different ways and things to like to solve that. It usually comes back to some version of like sending a slide deck and or sending emails. And when you do that, it's really hard sometimes in just words to get a point across, to summarize the conversation, to provide enough value to move the conversation forward. And most importantly, I think for the people that either aren't on the conversation, like in that discussion, to see what that discussion was about, how the conversations are going, or for people to just remember we're all busy. Like we have many meetings a day. I'm sure many people forgot what they probably had for breakfast 2 to 3 days ago, let alone a vendor or potential vendor they talk to. And so I think that becomes a big kind of sticking point. And so enabling, I would say, your champion, enabling your prospects to easily understand what you discuss, to enabling them to actually share information internally in a way that isn't just purely text, in a way that like, you can't tell if someone's opening emails and some of these other avenues, I think is really important. And like to the visual aspect, to a lot of other things, which I'm sure will kind of continue to get talked about here. I think that's always been a gap that I think is really important for salespeople to understand and to solve. And I think that's where like understanding the champion, making sure you're enabling them with the right information to share with the right people becomes so incredibly important.
Yeah, I might take a slightly bigger step back and then kind of get to a similar place as JB. You can think about the sales process in two halves. There's the beginning half where typically the customer is 100% willing to do whatever you say you want to do. Let's schedule a call. And they're like, yes. Let's schedule a demo. Okay, yes, right? But somewhere after that, the customer will tend to change their mindset and be like, I've got enough information and now I don't really want to deal with you except for when I need you. And you have to identify in your sales process when this shift happens. Mm-hmm. And I would tell you that as a sales rep, when you identify where that is, you need to change the way you're acting. So in the first part, you're selling. In the second part, I think you need to take your chair and literally pick it up and walk it to the other side of the table and sit next to your customer. And you need to teach them and you need to enable them, right? And I think that's a fundamentally different perspective, right? And so what does that mean? It's like the first thing you need to do is you need to walk them through what the series of steps are so that they can be successful selling internally. So you need to, so the very first part when the shift happens is to outline what are the steps that they need to go through in order to be successful in getting this purchased. This sounds weird the first time you say this to a sales rep, because they're like, what do you mean? I'm going to tell the customer how to buy. And it's like, yes, that is exactly what you're going to do. Like, you do this all the time. Most champions don't buy that many products over the course of the year. So they don't necessarily have the skills or the knowledge about how to deal with legal, about how to deal with procurement, if that exists, how to deal with legal, how to deal with
finance,
security, finance, IT. There's all these other groups that can like say no and totally kill it. And your champion is often just as sad as you are when that happens. So help them. Pick up your chair, move to their side of the table, and work collaboratively, right? And I think a big part of that is changing into a teacher as opposed to, or a tour guide, as opposed to selling, right? That's a big difference in between the kind of two parts of the sales process.
I mean, I think that's awesome. I think one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about at Qwilr is like, again, on those sort of different parts of like, as you go through discovery, trying to figure out who's in the room and who's sort of making those decisions. And yet, is there procurement? Is that going to be a thing? Are we going to be above or below the threshold where that monster will come and attack us? Are we going to, you know, is legal going to be involved in this? Is finance going to be involved? If so, who on finance? Like, is this going to some junior person who's going to read it and approve, or is this going to go to the CFO? Like blah, blah, blah. And I think sort of understanding what that looks like. I think that we've seen on...
This is where those opinion questions are killer,
Totally.
Mark, because you've
Totally.
asked what the opinions of other people on the team are. And so you're starting to figure out who else is on the team that's going to be a part of this, right? You gain so many little insights early in the sales process that will come back and help you when you get stuck. Like, it's so easy. Like, if I was selling Qwilr and I'm talking to JB and he mentions this guy, Mark, right? For me to later in the process say like, hey, you mentioned Mark. He must be important to this. You wouldn't have mentioned him to me if he wasn't. What's he thinking? Like, how have you been interacting with him? Just by saying the name just opens up a conversation. They can't ignore you. They can't be like, oh, Mark doesn't exist anymore. Like, that's, it's like, you're real.
Also secret, well, not a secret one, but just like a thing to be mindful of is sometimes you go through a process on this side and you talk to someone and they're like, and you're like, hey, you know, who's Mark, or how's this, or how's legal going to think about this? And like, they have, you know, some degree of considered answers. And sometimes you talk to them and you're like, so who's going to need to be involved in like buying this? And they're like, I'm pretty sure just if I say it's okay and my boss says it's okay, it'll be fine. One time in like, I don't know, 50, that's true. And the rest of the time you're like, because you have these junior sales reps who are like, oh, I mean, they said it, if he's okay. And then they're like, and his boss is already excited about it. Like, again, sometimes that is true, but also sometimes it just means you're dealing with someone pretty junior who doesn't actually know the ropes and doesn't know what's going on here. And that's fine. That's totally fine. But you, again, as you move your chair to sit next to them and help them, are going to have to be like, hey, by the by, like, you know, in some of, you know, this sort of slightly, I suppose this is slightly going into like a challenger mindset of like being like, lots of our customers have an experience as they, you know, they do have to work through legal on this sort of side and blah, blah. And so how do we sort of, you know, and if that comes up for you, you know, here's how we can work with you on that side, or here's how this or whatever else. I think that we've just been noticing in Qwilr a lot of late as a trend that's going up and up is like, that we found super interesting is for teams that use tools like Gong and Chorus and other sort of like call recording technology, is people have been so you can record the call that you're doing, the demo, you know, which is often with your champion, maybe one or two others are on the call. Now, obviously, Gong, we use that a lot for internal stuff of like, hey, how did that go, or reviewing, or going back later to understand, or, you know, giving feedback or whatever else, or sharing with junior reps. But actually, you can snippet that stuff and be like, hey, I'm just going to have like a 20-minute slice of this that's just the product demo. And it's me giving a tailored product demo relevant to your company and this thing. I'm going to drop that into my Qwilr proposal because we can embed videos. And then the CFO comes along later, or the security person, and they're like, what is this deal? What is this company? What's going on here? And if they can watch a product demo and frankly, watch it at like 1.5x, fit into their day. Like all of a sudden you're like, okay, I have like a lot of context here. I get it. I see how excited so-and-so is about this, or they asked this question. Oh, great. That makes sense to me. And there's little tricks that I think as you sort of in modern tech that you can do some interesting things with here. So I think like we're going to flip into Q&A in a second. Thank you to Matthew and Sergio. We'll go back and try a second go around on your question as well. If you have other questions, please start submitting them. We've got one final thing we're going to touch on here. We have spoken about the champion a bunch of times here, but we haven't sort of directly come at it head on. JB, like how, like, you know, how do you empower the champion? Like, how do you think about that? How do you train reps? Like, how do you sort of tell them to sort of to help me help you type thing with the champion, who is often, I mean, it's a bit of a cliched line about like, you know, they're the most important person in the sale, or the most important seller on your team rather. But it is critical.
It is. I think my opinion, first step is to make sure you actually have a champion. There's different words to call different people involved in the buying process. Influencer is thrown out a lot. There's other variations, but in short, make sure you actually have a champion, and that someone, kind of my definition is someone who, as I mentioned before, wants this just as bad as you, but actually has the ability to impact the decision in some way, shape, or form. And you can test them. You can do things like ask them to help you get in people's or get in front of people's calendars, like talk to certain folks, give insights about how certain people might think or view something. And then once you know that you actually have a champion because you tested them and they fit a list of criteria that aligns to like your industries, your business, and the people you sell to, it's important to identify how they might need help versus what kind of help you think they might need to make sure they align. You can take a train the trainer approach where you're actually kind of training them to have certain conversations, and you can also kind of validate that sometimes by just kind of like help me understand, like, how are you going to present this? How are you going to pitch this? Help me understand what your talk track is. Sometimes you can back into like, look, totally understand. I have 10 of these conversations a day. It's kind of what I do, and like convince them in certain scenarios to let you be a part of those discussions and conversations. And there's other strategies, but at its core, the thing you need to do, and the thing you need to make sure you do, is give them the information that they're going to need to have the conversations they're expecting to have. The worst thing you could do is either not provide them with the right information, the most relevant information, or the information or data that's going to help unstick this with the people they're talking to. So like, hey, who are you going to be having conversations with? What's important to them? How do you expect that conversation to go? What do you think they are or not, or might not like about this? And how can I help you? And making sure you give them that information, not things like an email with a couple of data points or a slide deck that you send to literally every single person after you talk to them, but something that's directly related to the conversations they're having.
Yeah. Number one, ask to be a part of the conversations. That's the most important one, right? You have to ask, and you have to figure out a way that works best with your ICP to do that. I agree with you 100%, JB, on the train the trainer. I'm going to just make that really kind of like skill-based for a second. I got this from one of my mentors, Dan Tyre, longtime HubSpotter, absolute gun. He did this thing where he's like, he would ask the prospect or customer, what did they like best about the product? And what that allows you to do is it like allows you to see how they're going to describe what it is that you do. And so then you can offer feedback. And the way you offer feedback is yes, and yes, that's exactly right. And then you say the things that are actually the most important parts of what you do, right? So you're giving them the sound bites without them knowing. Right. And then you say, okay, and what else did you like? Or like stack rank, what else is going back to your stack rank, JP? Like stack rank all the other things that you liked. Okay, so they say one thing and then they say another thing. And every time you do this, yes, and, yes, and, yes, and. And now you've already written your follow-up email, right? So the email that you send after that, right, is the things that they liked and exactly how to sell it. And oh, by the way, here's the 20-minute snippet of the demo, right, that you can send to everybody. And so now what they do is they just forward that email to everyone in the organization. And it has all of the things that you care about that they are then going to talk about internally. And so I think that's like a great way, like if they won't allow you into the room to have all those conversations, you're prepping them about how to talk about this. And I just think that when you tell it that way, it becomes more of a story, and your customer has a better chance of being able to retell your story about the product, which is really the thing you're trying to get them to do.
Love this. We've only got a few minutes left. We're going to answer a few questions, and then we're going to do a quick little summary and wrap up. Matthew had a great question, which is, any tips on how to quickly make sure that you're having the right sales conversation with the right person, ideally the decision maker? Super interesting question, because I think like a lot of sales methodologies tell you that you really have to only be talking with the decision maker, and I know that that's not always the case. But it is the ideal case. But yeah, how do you guys think about that? Like, I think like there definitely can be times where you're talking to someone who you're like, this company seems awesome. I'm definitely not talking to the right person. How do you think about that? Shep, why don't you've been second a few times. Let's give you some love.
Yeah,
what do you think?
I appreciate the love. I think that this, I would still direct you back to the discovery call and trying to learn about the team and the organization and how they work. That's why one of the reasons why I like those opinion questions, it starts to open up other people on the team and bring in those folks naturally. It's really awkward just be like, oh, so who else in the organization cares about this? Like, the person on the other end knows that's a gotcha question, right? They know that they're going to give up some information that you're going to try to use on them later. And that doesn't build trust, right? So I would say as early as possible in the process, whether you're on LinkedIn and you're scoping out all of the executives. If I'm selling to Qwilr, I know who Mark is, I know who Dylan is, I know who JB is, right? And maybe I bring up like, hey, like I'm talking to JB and I think he is the decision maker, but maybe it's Mark or Dylan. And I'm just like, hey man, like I was taking a look at your company profile. I hope I wasn't being too nosy, but it looks like Mark used to run sales. Like, is he a part of this conversation? Right. Like you can be a little bit of like a leading question there to like start to bring in other people into the conversation. But I think that's the first step for me.
JB, any thoughts? Straightforward? All good?
I agree.
Wonderful. Okay, so I think look, that's it. We had one final question from Sergio, which was, I think like what's the recommended timeline days for following up on a sent proposal once I see the customer is viewing it but hasn't replied? I think like on Qwilr's side of this thing, I think obviously with Qwilr you can see that they've viewed and you can track those views and whatever else. And I think that's sort of like that analytics can be very powerful. I think the thing that I think there is, you want to build up a regular cadence of communication back and forth with the customer. And I think that Shep sort of said it earlier about the phone number thing. Like, if you can be a bit cheeky, say, hey, do you mind if I text you about this? Or, hey, or whatever, something like this. And like, you start having, I think also, I feel sometimes with good reps, and again, this is to my plumber experience, short, sharp emails, or not walls of text, like short, like sometimes the wall of text makes sense. Sometimes you can send a whole proposal, but like sometimes you're having short, sharp things, little questions they can get back on quickly. And it's very low maintenance to just answer one question. And that just builds a degree of rapport. And I think that like that can also just be a good way to sort of actually drive that response. I don't know, JB, do you have an opinion on when it starts to get stale and dead? I mean, there's certainly like, I don't know, there definitely are thresholds here.
Yeah, I'll try to keep this quick to the end of the time. First thing I would say is I'm a big fan of using things called upfront contracts in scenarios like beginning of conversations to say, hey, look, there's one of two ways the conversation could go. Either we agree that it makes sense to continue the conversation, but I'll let you make that decision, or we could agree to shake hands and part ways. Obviously, you want to frame that probably better depending on who you're talking to. And then when you get to the end of the conversation, let them either opt in or opt out. If they choose to opt in, then I think it's really important not to get off that conversation or get off that call without something either booked or a date or time in mind, or when you will connect or when you will talk in the future. If things tend to fall off, my general rule of thumb is look at your average sales cycle. And if something goes beyond your average sales cycle, there's a high likelihood, very high likelihood that the deal probably won't close. I would kind of use that as a framework.
All right, friends, we are at time. John has sent a nice note about seeing proposal templates. On the Qwilr side, John, we're very happy to come and show you some examples. So we'll reach out on our side here. Huge thank you to two legends, Jonathon Blackburn, JB, and David Shepherd. Shep, as always with Qwilr, if you do have any questions about Qwilr, we'd love to have a demo. You can go to our website, book a demo anytime. A wonderful salesperson will come and do a delightful discovery call with you and hopefully try to understand your business and help you out. And we would love that. And again, just thanks for joining. It's been a real pleasure, and a huge thank you to JB and Shep. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye all. Thanks.